improvements. To get all the way to net zero emissions, however, some of these companies are planning to supplement emissions with cuts to carbon removal or negative emissions technologies, taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sequestering it. This is often referred to as CDR, which is a term we'll be using throughout the webinar today, which stands for carbon dioxide removal. So we're seeing commitments from companies across a range of industries, from energy to tech to airlines and to retailers. A few high profile, but certainly not necessarily best practice examples. Apple recently committed to be 100% carbon neutral for its supply chain and products by 2030, which would require reducing emissions by 75% and then developing carbon removal solutions for the remaining 25% of their footprint. British Airways just promised to purchase nature-based carbon offsets for all flights that they have within the UK. And then both BP and Shell have announced new ambitions to be net zero by 2050, including emissions from their extracted products. These ambitions include a sizable, but unknown at the moment, amount of nature-based offsets and CDR technologies. So we want to stress at the beginning of this discussion that emissions reductions are and should be the most important part of these commitments. So full stop there. That said, we're not talking about that today. We'll be talking about specifically the carbon removal part of these commitments. So what kinds of carbon removal are companies planning? How much carbon do they need to sequester? And especially, how should we evaluate these carbon removal components? Are they credible? Can they be implemented? And what would it take for a company to actually follow through on its plan? So to help us answer those questions today, we have three panelists with us. We have Alex Laplaza, an analyst at Lowercarbon Capital, which is a venture capital firm that funds research and invests in technologies to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, and provide relief from the impacts of climate change. We have Betty Cremmins, a climate entrepreneur who leverages the power of transparency and accountability to drive environmental and humanitarian action across the world's largest companies and public sector institutions. For the past decade, Betty has helped CDP, formerly the Carbon Disclosure Project, transition the world to a climate-resilient, water-secure, and deforestation-free economy. She's now leading the creation and launch of the US chapter of 1T.org, the Trillion Tree Platform, with the World Economic Forum, which has a mission to conserve, restore, and grow 1 trillion trees worldwide over the coming decade. And lastly, we have Jeremy Freeman, a scientist with a long-standing passion around open science, open source, and bringing communities together to tackle big problems. After nearly a decade working in science, software, and philanthropy, Jeremy founded CarbonPlan, which is working to improve the transparency and scientific integrity of carbon removal and climate solutions through open data and tools. So, as I set out in remarks earlier, we've seen a spate of recent net zero announcements from major companies. I'd love to get your sense on how important carbon removal will be to all these net zero commitments. So Betty, we're going to start with you and your thoughts on this issue.
Sure, thank you so much. And thank you for coordinating this webinar and having us today. I am, like everyone probably on this call, I'm thrilled to see the spate of net zero commitments from companies. And like everyone, I'm also skeptical of the robustness and the sincerity and making sure that they are covering all of the criteria that we need to see and that they're going to be implemented accordingly. And so based on my experience at CDP, I remember in 2010 when I started trying to engage companies on just accounting for their greenhouse gas emissions, we had companies say, you know, we don't have any greenhouses. Why are you asking me about greenhouse gas emissions? So I would just want to acknowledge how far we've come over even just the last decade. You know, companies back then were setting like 20% by 2020 goals because it sounded good for comms with, you know, or just sort of setting goals about what they think they can achieve, a 5% intensity reduction by this year of this part of our operations. And so a lot of the work that I did in my former role at CDP was getting companies to fully account for scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, all parts of their scope 3, of all 15 categories that were relevant to their operations, and then setting robust, increasingly science-based targets to ensure that they were decarbonizing along a pathway of what they needed to do for their piece of the science according to their sector. And so I think we need to build upon a lot of that work as we look to net zero to make sure that companies are credibly decarbonizing not just their own operations, but upstream into their supply chain, as well as downstream into the use phase and disposal of their products, as well as their investment portfolio, their policy engagement, and all the other areas that they touch emissions across the larger world. And so when we're looking to make sure companies are setting net zero targets, We want to make sure they've got their own house in order, they're actively decoupling emissions growth from revenue growth, they're on the right trajectory, they're a growing, robust company, but they're also showing a decline in emissions, and they're also investing in carbon dioxide removal that makes sense for their business at the time today, long into the future, hopefully getting to net zero well before 2050, and that they're looking backwards into their past to make sure that we're addressing the cumulative emissions problem we have in the atmosphere. So a lot of things to unpack on this webinar, but really excited to make sure that we're looking at these commitments within the historical context and making sure that we're pushing the leaders forward in a credible way, but that we're sort of normalizing these things along. You know, we're at almost 1,000 companies who have committed to set science-based targets just in the last 6 years. And I really want to make sure that we rapidly move those along from a 2-degree alignment to a 1.5-degree alignment and eventually to a net zero alignment. And I think a lot of the leading companies that you indicated are sort of the most innovative, who can put some capital into innovative projects that maybe the economics don't make sense right now, but they can sort of start to move markets. And there's a big body of companies just like watching and waiting who want to be fast followers. And anything we can do to show credibility and show them the pathway forward will really give them confidence in helping bring their capital along and driving the price down for everyone and driving the robustness of this new carbon economy that we seem to be creating, a decarbonized economy, but a focus on carbon removal as another form of the economy. So I can speak a lot more to the tree side now in my current role, but wanted to provide those framing remarks.
Thanks, Betty. And Jeremy, you come from a more science background. Could you speak to some of the science and the role that will play in these net zero commitments?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, thanks for having us. And this is such a great group. I can definitely speak to maybe some of the kind of variation across what some of these organizations are trying to do. One quick thing I want to say before that. So our org focus on scientific integrity and transparency of carbon removal. So I want to be super transparent. One of the ways we do that is we do work with organizations across a variety of sectors, helping them kind of make high quality decisions about carbon removal and doing it in a transparent way. That includes some of the kinds of companies making these kinds of pledges. So just wanted to say that up front. And you know, we care deeply that that's done in a quality way, in a very transparent way. I guess a few dimensions that we've seen variation on across what these different organizations are doing from the implementation side, or at least starting to do when it comes to carbon removal. Definitely one dimension, I think we're going to get into this more later, is the sort of biological, technological axis in terms of the nature of solutions being considered. We prefer the word biological to natural, but we can talk about that too. And you know, for us, I want to be clear, I don't think any one of those or anything on that spectrum is more or less authentic or inherently better or worse. They're all interesting, they're all exciting, they all have a lot of challenges. Again, I think we're going to talk about that more later, but that's something to highlight, is that there's a lot of range in terms of what's being said and what's been started to be done across that spectrum. Another, I think, interesting dimension is sort of the nature of what's being considered to be paid for, in the sense that I think some of these efforts are around maybe call it procurement, or sort of actually paying money for things that might be considered credits or tons. In other cases, what we're seeing is stuff that looks a lot more like project finance or even kind of research and development funding. And you know, coming from a science background, that's really interesting to see. I mean, I think a big part of the challenge with CDR is that so much of it is kind of early stage technology. It needs support for research and development. It's not ready necessarily yet for kind of procurement. So I think it's really interesting to see a spectrum there. And then maybe the third thing that I think is interesting to look at across the things that companies are trying to do in this space is the degree to which they are sufficiently in dialogue with the challenges of the past. And I think we're all aware that a lot of efforts, especially in the world of offsets in the past, haven't worked. And there's nothing fundamentally wrong. It's just that these things haven't worked before. And I think it's really important to look at whether companies are having serious conversations about the degree to which that's true and why that's true and how what they're doing might be different. I think this also echoes some of what Betty was saying. So I think that's something we're also, you know, we're seeing folks kind of doing stuff that looks like the status quo, and we're seeing folks that are trying to do things differently. Not that they necessarily are getting it right, but I think that's also interesting to look at.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Alex, you're coming from a totally third perspective on this. Do you want to share any comments?
Sure. I think Jeremy and Betty hit very great points, and let me just say thanks for having me, and thank you all the attendees for attending and participating. But from my perspective, from the private sector, you know, I think it's like Betty said, very exciting, because for a long time, there's been this sort of catch-22 where neither the public nor private sector was really willing to be the first mover without the participation of the other sector. And so now we're seeing the private sector kind of break that cycle and really forge ahead and try to plant the flag and be the smart, systematic thinker on carbon removal. So that's very exciting. You know, we can get into what this might mean for the industry as a whole later on, but like Jeremy said, you know, this is a moment that feels different than the past, and I think it's quite exciting.
Thanks. And Alex, I'm actually going to come right back to you. So we're seeing all these commitments for plans for CDR, and are these plans realistic, especially in respect to carbon removal? And is there a reason to think that companies will be or won't be able to implement them? And as a third point on that, is there a reason that we're seeing an increase in CDR interest and their inclusion in these commitments, you know, right now?
Yeah, so there's a few questions in there, and I guess I'll try to break them down into, you know, first, how realistic implementation is. Second, why these companies, and third, why now? And so on implementation, a lot of it is going to have to do with industry. You know, cutting emissions from data centers is quite a different challenge than from airplanes and cement factories, for example. But on this point, I think in terms of implementation, you know, the Amazons, the Microsofts, the Apples of the world, particularly these big tech companies, could get us quite far. Microsoft, for example, you know, they set an internal price of around $15 a ton. So covering all their scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, 16 million emissions a year, would only cost them $240 million. And so I say only because these are companies that make $40 billion a year in gross profit after taxes. So they could jump that internal price up to $60 a ton, and it would still only cost them 2.5% of their gross profits after taxes. But more importantly, I think, you know, they've made big commitments, and if they really want to make good on these commitments in the long term, they'll have to pay a higher price now to bring the cost down in the future. So on implementation, whether it's realistic or not is really more a question of whether they're really willing to bear the cost of deployment-led innovation. And so by that, I mean doing things like what Denmark did with wind, and Germany and solar, California with EVs, you know, paying a cost premium in the near term. And people like to use these as examples of when people overpaid. But really, I think it's more like an investment. You know, there's a high upfront cost that will generate benefits and cost savings down the road. So why them? You know, I think they're well suited, these tech companies in particular, like I mentioned, because again, they have tens of billions of dollars of profits every year, and they pay a lot of money in taxes. You know, whether they should pay more or not is a different question, but so it's in their interest to monetize things like 45Q. And personally, I'd rather see companies like them do that for carbon removal than you know, oil and gas companies using it for enhanced oil recovery, which is largely what 45Q has been. And then the third question, why now? So they like to frame it as an opportunity, you know, a moon shot or an earth shot or whatever kind of PR gimmick they want to go with. But really, it's a lot of risk management in terms of policy and the broader social license to operate. So on policy, you know, I'm guessing this internal carbon price Microsoft said is kind of in anticipation of a carbon price in the future. But more generally, I just spent 2 years in Silicon Valley, and I learned like these companies really do consider themselves to be the fixers of the world's problems. But they're starting to acknowledge that their role in driving what is likely to be the largest problem in the 21st century. And so there's a lot of external pressure. There has been for over a decade, you know, when they started building data centers. Greenpeace has been doing a great job holding them to account. But I'd also point out now there's internal pressure as well. You know, a lot of credit needs to go to these people ratcheting up the pressure inside these companies. At the C-suite level, it seems like they're you know, a bit more moral decision making taking hold. People like Lisa Jackson, the Obama EP administrator, getting into Apple, and also company employees of these companies really saying, you know, stop developing tools for oil and gas drillers and put your money where your mouth is.
Thanks, that was great. And I see some vigorous nodding from Jeremy and Betty. Jeremy, do you have any comments you want to make on that?
Yeah, Alex, that was fantastic. Maybe something to highlight in terms of realism that I think is both the excitement of this challenge, but also the challenge. And it is really this point around cost. And I think, Alex is absolutely right. In order to do this seriously, it's going to be really expensive. High quality, permanent, durable CDR right now is really expensive. And I think we'll talk a little more about durability later. But I think that's just a reality we need to confront. And right now, realism is going to depend on the degree to which there is a sufficient both supply of CDR, and it is at a cost that, while maybe really high, is still kind of within reach for some of these early movers. I think the risk is that these big commitments get made, and then because it's either too expensive or not available, we're going to see folks basically start to pay less for stuff that's lower quality and unlikely to be real. And I think that's to me the biggest danger. So it's really important that, things like quality we set a bar around that, and we set some transparency around how we're evaluating that, because that's what's going to force folks to pay a lot for stuff right now that hopefully will become cheaper in the future. I also think when it comes to the risk of sort of paying less for stuff that's bad, one other way to mitigate that, and this is kind of could be a bigger topic as well, is kind of a reframing. So a lot of these commitments get stated in terms of neutrality and in terms of sort of paying for tons or getting credit for tons. Another way to look at it is just how much money are you spending? And, companies could decide we want to put a giant pile of money towards CDR, and some of it's going to go to actually procure something that we can actually call a ton. Some of it's not. Some of it's going to go to research. Some of it's going to go to investments. We don't need to get too precise about exactly how many tons that money is accounting for. The question is, how much did we spend, and did it go to something good? And that's something that we need to be incredibly transparent about. We all need to be looking at. They need to be radically transparent about where the money's going and if it's going somewhere good. But that's a real opportunity. And I would much rather see these companies spend a lot of money on stuff that we can all publicly kind of track whether it's working or not, as opposed to paying, $10 a ton for some offset that's probably not real.
And Betty, that seems like it will have some relevance to your 10 trillion trees.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I mean, to answer your broader questions about sort of why now, I guess in complete agreement with everything said, I would just add another angle, which is the investor pressure. So there's been an incredible surge of investors really pushing on ESG, environmental social governance, and transparency of companies around, non-financial metrics that actually do have a financial implication. We just forgot to account for things like clean air and clean water and human health when we set up the economic accounting systems. So there's been a huge surge of that, but then with the introduction of the TCFD, which is the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, great acronym, in 2017, that's really codified how companies are going to be asked to report on two areas of risk moving forward. One is physical risk, and one is transition risk. And so physical risk is extreme weather events, droughts, floods, hurricanes, and all the impacts of climate. Physical or transition risk is the decarbonization pathway that they're on, and making sure that these companies will be viable investments in a low carbon economy and will actually be leaders of a low carbon economy. And so as companies are looking ahead, and a lot of the initial investments you've seen and the initial announcements are from the companies who want to be those leaders of the low carbon economy. They want to be providing the low carbon tools to enable the rest of the world to decarbonize faster. And they want to be on the winning end of that game. And so they're making the first investments for their own companies to then position themselves to be in the position to support everybody else, which feels like a good move in the right direction. I would say on the physical risk side, the way that companies are able to tackle both the transition risk and the physical risk is by investing in CDR that's of nature-based or biological solutions, because a lot of times you can invest in conservation or restoration of ecosystems that not only decarbonize and capture carbon, but also protect from floods and droughts and hurricanes and all sorts of extreme weather events as well. And so they're a nice buffer zone and have all sorts of other biological impacts. So you can sort of hit both by the same investment, and that's really enticing for certain companies. Plus it's beautiful, and who doesn't love trees? So it's easy for everyone to sort of wrap their heads around. It's not this like techie wonky thing, it's like a huggable tree. And then the third thing I would just add is why now is I think on timing. So in a lot of the decarbonization space, you can sort of change out your light bulbs and get a 7-month payback on your investment. Or a lot of these, even renewables, we're starting to see the payback period come down in 5 years, 10 years time. With a lot of the CDR, you need to plant the tree now, and then it won't sequester carbon for, it'll be like a 50-year horizon of when that tree is actually going to be capturing the carbon. Same with a lot of the technical solutions where you need to make early stage investments to do R&D to get to the process in a few years' time. And so a lot of the announcements and investments now are just to help jumpstart things that we know won't pay back for a while, but with 2050 coming very, very soon, we need to make the investments now and sort of sequence the accounting accordingly.
Thanks, Betty. So we've obviously mentioned nature or biology-based solutions and also tech-based solutions. And each of these has some differences in terms of R&D and time frame and storage. So Jeremy, could you speak a little bit about your thoughts on tech-based versus nature-based and how companies are currently investing in them?
Sure, absolutely. And again, want to start by saying it's a continuum, sort of biology to technology, and I really like emphasizing that because I think we don't need yet more kind of barriers and walls between communities in this area. And honestly, as a scientist, one of the things that I find so exciting about the CDR field is the wide range of science across that spectrum. I think there's really cool stuff happening at both ends and kind of in the middle. So just to say that, all of it, it's all hard. And there are challenges on every side. So when it comes to DAC, just to be clear, like I think it's really exciting. I also think if we can't do it at scale safely for a few $100s a ton, it's never going to happen. And that's a huge challenge. And there's great folks working on it and folks doing great science. It's really exciting, but it's a major challenge. I think on the biological side, so think about sort of forests and soil. A big challenge is around durability and around the permanence of the storage. So when we think about CO2 in the atmosphere, that's an 1,000-year problem that we've created in terms of its lifetime. When we do geological sequestration or sequestration with CDR with mineralization, that's effectively permanent at a time scale also of about 1,000 years or much longer. When it comes to projects involving forests, projects involving soil carbon, there's a lot of great reasons to do it. A lot of great reasons to do conservation, a lot of great reasons for regenerative agriculture. But if we're specifically talking about the CDR aspect, the carbon removal potential of these approaches, I think we have to be realistic about the timescales that we're talking about. And when it comes to forests, especially and soil, there's a lot of aspects that limit durability or limit the permanence of the storage. Some of those are social. If we're talking about putting sort of conservation easements or other kind of contractual obligations that prevent things like deforestation, there's a time scale over which that may or may not actually continue to happen and continue to work. If we're paying a farmer to do something different that captures more carbon in the soil, maybe there's a contract for 10 years. What happens after 10 years? I certainly don't know of contractual engagements that any human institution has ever had that outlast 1,000 years, except maybe the Catholic Church. So I think that's a major challenge. And there's also physical risks when it comes to forests. Actually, Betty was just talking about this, things like fire, drought, and insects. Those things all limit the potential of carbon stored in forests. And I do think we've had, probably for understandable reasons, something of a sort of silver bullet mentality around forests when it comes to these issues and kind of ignoring them. So, very specifically, and Nicole told us in advance we should have at least one thing we disagree about. So maybe this is it, Betty. I think the hype around trillion trees, again, forests are great. A lot of great reasons to invest in forests. I really want to be clear about that. But the hype around it, and even though the hype specifically around that number trillion, that comes from a paper that was published in Science magazine last year that had not one, not two, but 7 criticisms published in the same journal. It probably should have been retracted. That's a problem with the corporate academic publishing industry, topic for a different webinar. The point is that was a paper that made a claim about the scale of potential reforestation for carbon removal. It got it wrong. The numbers are off by at least a factor of 5, if not 10. It got a lot of hype around it. And now I think we're talking about this as a solution that can achieve this incredible scale. And we're not seriously thinking about the science that tells us risks associated with fire and insects and drought are a major limitation. And I totally get it. I get both the enthusiasm and I get that trillion sounds exciting. And if it was sort of the 10 billion trees, some of which might burn or be consumed by insects, like that's less exciting. But I think just as we take the science seriously on the problem of climate change, we need to take the science seriously when it comes to the solutions. So again, there are challenges on every front, and that's what's so exciting about this field and exciting about this challenge as a whole. But I think we have to be realistic.
Betty, I'm going to send it back to you.
I couldn't agree more. So I think, you know, just as we're investing in solutions, we need to be cognizant of where those solutions have trade-offs, and, you know, the Sustainable Development Goals and all of the social and environmental and economic trade-offs need to be weighed on each of these solution areas. And just as trees, you know, are susceptible to droughts and floods and hurricanes and beetles in their permanence, they're also susceptible to those in their current status. And so we need to not only be conserving and restoring existing forests, but we need to be ensuring that they're climate proof or as climate resilient as possible, so that they do their job that we want them to be doing long into the future. So, you know, yeah, just there's no silver bullet, there's no magic solution. I think we need to be investing across all fronts of both biological and technological solutions, and not sort of putting all of our eggs in any one basket. But I also, and I'm constantly harping on this, even as a greenhouse gas aficionado climate expert, if we're only looking at trees just for their carbon benefits, we're completely missing all of the other benefits. So I think we need to make sure that we're investing in forests and trees for all sorts of social and environmental impacts, of which they happen to be really good carbon sequestering machines that are currently doing their job. They currently, here in the US, currently capture about 15% of emissions. Our US forests are net capturing, they're net sponges, they're not net emitters. Globally, they are net emitters. But here in the US, we're currently capturing about 15%, and we could go up to about 30%, given the sort of where we think we can conserve and reforest. And so that provides a really cool opportunity to get started right now and put money into things right now, while we're also developing R&D and investing in all sorts of other solutions. So totally agree. We need to weigh pros and cons across everything.
We were supposed to disagree. Maybe just if one quick addition to that. Totally agree with you on sort of thinking about it as investment. I think something for this entire community to be then really thinking seriously, and maybe holding some of these organizations accountable on is what claims they're making. So I completely agree with you. There are great reasons to spend money on forests and conservation and ecosystems. We should just do that and call it spending money on forests and conservation and ecosystems. If we call it an offset, if we claim credit specifically around the carbon, then it's a very different conversation. And then we really need to talk about the fact that you are spending money and getting a ton that's going to last 30 years and might burn down afterwards. And they're just very different framings. And what I worry about is that in some of the announcements we're seeing and some of the claims, especially in the past around forests and forest offsets, you know, $20 a ton via forest, that gets you a credit for a ton, you know, that's probably not real, or almost definitely not real. And I think if we talk about it as investments in conservation, that's great. If we talk about it as getting credit for carbon, that's different.
All right. Oh, Betty, did you have a comment on that?
No, I agree. I mean, I think just to add to that, we've been working really hard to ensure that the Trillion Trees Initiative is working to conserve, restore, and grow 1 trillion trees. And we very specifically use them in that order, prioritizing conservation of our existing forest as the most important area. I think everyone thinks trillion trees and jumps to like put a bunch of trees in the ground and maybe some Christmas tree farm looking things. And, you know, that's the enticing thing, is like get your employees and, you know, your students out there planting new trees, which is one piece of it. But we really want to focus on conservation of existing forests, because those are the lungs of the planet, and those are providing all the existing ecosystem benefits and carbon capture benefits. And we need to appreciate that they are currently doing their job without us even investing in them in some cases. And so anything we can do to ensure future conservation and permanent conservation, and not just avoided deforestation, but actual conservation, is the important first step. The next important step is restoration. So you mentioned a lot of the forests that we've lost to fires or beetles or droughts. And so anything we can do to encourage natural restoration at an accelerated speed and do so in a responsible manner will ensure that those forests are able to regain their strength in capturing carbon. And then planting trees where it's important and necessary and viable in urban areas and in silvopasture and all sorts of other places that we can responsibly reforest, understanding the time scale that it takes from when you put that tree in the ground until it actually begins to capture carbon. And that's exactly why we say conserve, restore, and grow, because it's not just planting trees, it's growing trees, which is yet another area of importance. And I think we're working a lot on remote sensing and geospatial mapping to ensure that we're tracking the actual growth of those trees, not just planting them, celebrating, and calling it a day. So I think there's a lot of even technology that can come into play on the natural side, and we need a lot of investment even in the support systems to ensure that we're making the right investments and then tracking and making the right claims off the right investments moving forward. And I think a lot of that confidence will enable more companies and governments to join the party, because because of all the controversy in the past, there's a strong hesitation to jump in now. And so I think anything we can do to give more confidence will increase everybody's piece of the pie.
Thanks, Betty. And so speaking of investors being interested in CDR technologies at the moment, Alex, did you want to make any comments on sort of CDR, nature-based or tech-based from a more investor or finance perspective?
Yeah, so I guess I won't wade into the debate of technological versus natural or biological, as Jeremy likes to say. But I think what I will add is that bringing it back to this conversation about what these corporations are doing and corporate climate commitments is, I think generally these companies take a pretty narrow view of carbon removal solutions more broadly, you know, what their costs are and where their costs are going. And it creates this kind of false binary between this you know, natural and biological versus technological. You know, from my position as an investor in carbon removal solutions, I found this false binary is kind of a result of people just think there's, you know, cheap forest management on one side and exorbitant direct air capture on the other. And as Jerry mentioned, you know, it's a spectrum, and there's quite a bit of technologies in there in between. But, you know, Microsoft, for example, they mentioned that they don't think that the technologies they need exist yet when they first announced their, I think it was in January, when they first announced their carbon negative ambitions. And I just don't think that's true. I think they exist, just not at the prices that they want. So, you know, from my perspective as an investor, what I've seen in both our portfolio companies as well as companies in the pipeline is a recent explosion, really, of these new, really exciting approaches that are beginning to shift the narrative around solutions and their costs. And I think how we remove carbon and what it will cost to do so will be very different 20 years from now, even 10 years from now. We just need the help of these big corporations and their demand to help get us there. That being said, as both Betty and Jeremy mentioned, you know, each approach on this spectrum, or each approach within this spectrum, is hard, and each approach has very different types and degrees of trade-offs, and therefore we need to be really nuanced and systematic about how we approach it. And so, yeah, I'd like to highlight a really great piece written recently by Dr. Holly Jean Buck, who argues that, I think it's called "How to Decolonize the Atmosphere." And she argues that often, you know, we just view this challenge very myopically in technical terms and in financial terms. But really the decisions we make around carbon removal are really deeply and inherently political. So just want to flag that.
That's an excellent flag, and one that we should all keep in mind in conversations about CDR. To go back just briefly to the myopic view on company commitments. So we are seeing so many companies come out with commitments that do include CDR. And Alex, this one's going to come to you first. But are we seeing that these commitments are, you mentioned explosion of sort of companies coming out with new technology. Are we seeing these commitments driving that, or expanding that, or helping that in any way in a broader sense? Or do they feel sort of more separate to you?
I think it's the former. I think, you know, like I mentioned, there's largely been this catch-22 between the public and the private sector, and it seems like the private sector is trying to break it. And so what I hope that does is really open the door for the participation of the public sector. You know, recently we saw Senators Murkowski and Manchin introduce a bipartisan bill in support of carbon removal, and you know, the participation of the public sector is critical, because I don't think you'll have a thriving carbon removal industry without policymakers coming in and saying carbon removal needs to be a key feature of both climate and industrial policy, without fear of how corporations will respond. So corporations acting first and saying, hey, it's okay for you to move on this as well, is critical. In terms of how this recent explosion and the recent commitments might change carbon removal as an industry into the future, what I hope it does is that I hope it creates, you know, a model that actors in both the public and private sector can then follow. You know, it seems like increasingly people are very conscientiously trying to incorporate transparency, scientific verification, and open access to really address the issues like trust and double counting and permanence that have really plagued carbon markets for a long time. So hats off to both Betty and Jeremy and their respective organizations for really leading that charge on that front. But I mean, more simply, I think the recent announcements really start to situate carbon removal not in the PR departments of corporations just trying to greenwash, but actually in the hands of, you know, engineers and managers and the real movers and shakers in companies trying to get carbon out of the atmosphere.
Thanks. And Betty, as a frontline person in that effort, do you have anything you want to say?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, I can speak a little bit to my previous work at CDP. CDP was one of the founding members of the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which alongside WWF, WRI, and the UN Global Compact. And that initiative sort of in 2015 found about 20 different companies that were setting what they were calling science-based targets to align to the Paris Agreement at the time. And sort of looked at how each of them had done the math, looked at the science, and then took all of their independently produced methodologies and tried to combine them into what has now become the Science-Based Targets Initiative, building upon those initial first movers and then creating methodologies and guidance and criteria for each sector for now almost 1,000 companies to follow. And as I mentioned, in that time, we've moved towards from a 2 to a 1.5 degree alignment. And now there's new work right now to codify what net zero targets will look like. So I would encourage folks to look at the Science-Based Targets Initiative website, which has a draft and soon to be released guidance on all of the criteria that they'll be looking for to certify and guide net zero science-based targets and what that will really mean. And a lot of it does include the role of CDR and the non-overinflated role of CDR in those commitments as well, right? So making sure that it's contextualized and not overemphasized in those commitments. And I think that that's really important because that will help show the pathway forward for many other companies to follow. I think it's also interesting to see another but parallel initiative called Transform to Net Zero that just launched, I think it was a week or two ago. BSR and EDF are the guiding NGOs, and then Unilever and Microsoft and many of these other companies are in that initiative. And it's all really about implementing net zero commitments. So making sure that they're collaborating on innovation, on transparency, on accountability, on policy engagement, on all of the factors that we've been talking about, and trying to have sort of a non-competitive sandbox for companies who are like, all right, we'll make the commitment, but how do we actually achieve this, and what do we do next? So I think there's a really interesting spirit right now of, you know, to Alex's point of sort of breaking through that impasse between public and private, and I'm seeing good initiatives pop up to bring us all forward together.
Thanks. And Jeremy, do you have anything you want to say on that from a transparency and open science perspective?
Yeah, maybe great points have been made. I think, you know, the idea of investing in R&D is really exciting. It's clearly something this field needs seriously. And I mean, just to put it in perspective, you know, the sort of federal budget around carbon removal research and development, you know, is maybe, well, it's tiny relative to the billions of dollars that are spent every year on research and development in the biomedical sciences, which is the world I used to come from. And I've, you know, in that world, always noticed that interesting things happen when there's kind of interesting synergies between public government funded research and private sector research. And, you know, I will absolutely be the first to say we cannot do this without serious kind of large scale government infrastructure and investment in research. I absolutely hope we are on a path towards that, fingers crossed. But I think there's a role for the private sector to play in terms of accelerating research and development. There are reasons that sometimes companies can do things and sort of do things differently and kind of get early stage things started in a way that then almost becomes a template or a model for how ultimately kind of government funded research happens. I've seen that kind of back and forth play out in the world of biomedical sciences. And I think it's a really interesting thing to maybe explore, you know, ways that organizations like Alex's could actually sort of pave a path forward what it would look like for kind of government, you know, investment in government funded research in this area to look like. So again, I think when it comes to trying to set models, things like transparency and quantification are absolutely important to get right out of the gate. And I do think that word transparency, it gets thrown around a lot. We have to be really clear about what it means and take it seriously. And I think, you know, unfortunately right now still, a lot of conversations, a lot of efforts to kind of quantify and evaluate projects are happening behind closed doors. They happen under NDAs. We got to work on bringing more of this into the open. Certainly in the world of biomedical sciences, every community I've ever been a part of, if it worked in the open, it moved faster. Research moves faster when people are sharing ideas, when they're collaborating, when we know what doesn't work. If we have a lot of stuff out there that's bad, we should all find out about it, because then we can pivot and start working on the good stuff. But if the only people who know what's bad are people that are having conversations behind closed doors and under NDAs that can't talk about it, well, then we're not going to get very far. So I think there's a huge need for research. There's a role for the private sector to play, but we got to set the right model. And I think transparency has to be a serious part of what we're doing differently.
Thanks, Jeremy. And so this is our final question. So if any of our panelists have points that they want to make sure they make, now is the time. But so Jeremy, I'm actually going to go right back to you, because I think you touched upon this with your discussion of transparency and openness. But what should people be paying attention to when they read about these commitments from companies or companies' plans to achieve them?
Yeah, it's a great thought or question. Three high-level things I guess I would focus on. I mentioned this one earlier, but I think number one is the degree to which companies are really in dialogue with things that haven't worked in the past. And I think you can even see it in some of the announcements. You see folks saying, look, we know this approach to offsets has had problems. It's had conflicts of interest. It's had issues with oversight. It's been in some cases fraudulent. We know that, and here's why what we're doing is going to be different. Again, they should not get credit yet for doing it, because they have to prove that what they're doing is actually better, but at least to show that they're in dialogue with what's happened in the past, why it's been a problem, and why potentially the thing that they're going to be doing is different. That's, I think, really important to look for. If folks aren't even engaging with how this hasn't worked before and they're just doing the status quo, then I think we're not going to make it. That's not the way forward. Number two is really the degree to which companies are taking quality seriously when it comes specifically to carbon removal. So what are the things they're doing to make sure the projects they're evaluating, either for procurement or that the projects they're investing in, that they take quality seriously, where quality includes things like permanence and durability and kind of measurement and the ability to measure progress, safety, all these dimensions. Are they taking that seriously? And what are they doing concretely and specifically to make sure that the projects they're evaluating have a really high bar on quality? I think, to sum up a lot of the challenges with offsets in the past, it has been a problem of quality, and the fact that everything about the system sort of pushes the bar down on quality and drives people to pay for very small amounts of money for stuff that's not real. So if we're going to raise that bar, we all need to sort of act as a constituency for quality. And I want to look to what companies are really doing, both saying and doing, to ensure that they are hitting a high bar on quality. And then the last thing is maybe sort of specificity. Part of what's so complicated about specifically carbon removal is there's so many different aspects to it and so many different ways to frame different kinds of projects and different kinds of investments. Companies should say what they're doing and be really clear about it. So, for example, one that we wrote a piece on recently, avoided emissions and carbon removal are not the same, and it's complicated, and sometimes there's overlap. And especially when you get into some of the hybrid engineered systems, you might have something that right now is not performing CDR because it's actually rerouting a waste CO2 stream into permanent storage, but in the future, it could be part of a CDR system. So we need to start having a good, consistent, clear language about this stuff, and companies should say what they're doing. And if they're paying money for something that will ultimately become a form of CDR, but maybe it's not doing that right now, that's great. Talk about it that way. I think we need to get specific, we need to get kind of scientific, and we need to be accurate about what's happening, and all move forward together on that front.
Thanks, Jeremy. And Alex, coming from a private sector perspective, do you have any thoughts on what people should be paying attention to?
Yeah, so echo everything Jeremy had to say. I would also point out, personally, what I look for when these companies are going to start announcing what purchases they actually make is who they're giving their revenue to. Because a lot of these companies, the revenue is sorely needed, and it will really help them drive up the learning curve and bring their costs down. And so part of the reason there was this catch-22 I mentioned was just because it was too expensive for anyone to really want to get involved. No one wanted to pay $700 a ton when you can just pay $5 for a poorly verified credit elsewhere. And so without anyone paying that price and pumping the money in, a lot of these approaches are not going to be able to reduce their costs. And so that's why it's great to see a company like Stripe raise their hand and volunteer to pay that higher price per ton in an effort to drive these costs down in the long term by learning. So in terms of what I want to see if companies recognize that, yes, we might have to pay a premium upwards of $700 a ton, but it's because they recognize that the impact will be larger than just the number of tons they put into the ground.
Thanks. And Betty, final thoughts from
Well, I guess we're keeping it in threes, so I'll stick to the trifecta here. So when I'm looking at a net zero commitment or an announcement from a company, I'm looking at three things too. So first, I'm looking to see which scopes are included. I want to know that they're including scope 1, direct emissions, scope 2, purchased electricity, but all forms of scope 3. So I want to see a full value chain approach where they're not just talking about their own operations, they're actually looking at where their suppliers and where their customers have impacts. They're actually accounting for those emissions, especially if they're from natural sources, and that they're actually working to decarbonize those as well. Because it's not enough to call it a carbon dioxide removal if you haven't actually accounted for the impact you've been having all these years. And so I've seen a little bit of disconnect from some companies there and want to make sure that they're accounting for current impacts and emissions reductions and removals. So scopes included is my first one. My second is dates. So if they say we will be net zero by 2050, there's still 30 years between now and then. And like, what are they doing between now and then? And what's the path? What are they currently doing? And what is the pathway forward? And what is the pathway back to their historical emissions? So it's not enough just to claim that you will be net zero by 2050, but what you're doing now, next year, in the next decade, as we look forward and look back. And then the third is I want to make sure that that company is fully understanding not just its emissions, but its full impacts in its future in a low carbon, climate constrained economy. So I want to make sure that they're future proofing their business and that they are not investing in the wrong direction, sort of investing towards a clean economy and helping oil and gas extract better or whatever the other, negative impacts that they could be having from other parts of their business. I want to make sure that their business is fully aligned and that all parts are leaning towards a low carbon economy on the policy engagement side, on the investment side, on the customer engagement side, on the supply chain side, et cetera. So I look across all of their operations and all of their corporate engagement to make sure it's all mimicking their carbon commitment.
Thanks, Betty. And we'll go to the Q&A portion now. So our first question is actually to any of the panelists, so just raise your hand if you're interested in answering. But what are your thoughts on terminology that companies are using? Net zero versus carbon negative versus carbon neutral are all catchy terms. Do you see any chance to draw more attention to more crucial goals for companies like GHG reduction, CO2 productivity, or CO2 intensity, especially within the attention of investors? All right, Jeremy, go for it.
Yeah, maybe just a quick question. It's a great question. I'll maybe use this to say, I think framing is in some ways everything. And I think there's a lot of opportunity. I mentioned this a little bit before to change the framing that some of these companies are using. And in particular, I think the framing of neutrality is what has sort of, led to a lot of sort of paying for things in the world, through mechanisms like offsets that are just broken and haven't worked. And we need to get away from. And, I would often want to know, or I think it's interesting to ask for some of these companies, again, not, what are you trying to retrieve from a neutrality perspective, but how much money can you spend? And then we can have a conversation about how to spend that money in the best possible way. And I think one of the benefits of that is that we can have just a more wide-ranging conversation about how that money can be spent. Again, we can think about it going to R&D, we can think about it going to actual sort of purchase of carbon removal. And we can, it's a broader set of things that it can be invested in. And there's a wider variety of ways we can track progress and be more open and transparent about how that progress is taking place. I think neutrality and an obsession with the framing of neutrality sort of wedges you into a corner where you have to get the tons. And that's why you end up then spending money on these BS offsets that are super cheap, because it's the only way that you can achieve the tons that you need at the level you've claimed for the money that you have available. If you instead just took the same amount of money and spent it on good stuff, It's a very different framing. And I think there's actually a challenge here because I don't know what to call that other thing. So maybe the question asker has good ideas. I'm not sure what the name of that is, but I think it's different than neutrality and it's framed really differently. And it could be a lot better in terms of moving progress.
Alex, do you have something you want to say on that?
Yeah, just because they tacked on asking from the perspective of an investor, and you know, the question is a good one. It is very easy to equivocate a lot of these terms. And I also saw another question posed that I think I would merge into this one about what are the metrics by which investors kind of evaluate these projects. And I would just like to highlight, so obviously the devil's in the details of what it actually means from a carbon perspective, but I would like to highlight the incredible work that CarbonPlan is doing. They have, I would point everyone towards their directory on what these solutions and technologies actually mean, both from a cost, permanence, quality perspective. And so to answer, you know, how we actually evaluate the difference between what someone says they want to do and what they're actually doing, I rely on their resources a lot. So point in that direction.
Yes, to all of that. If I could just add, I think coming from a world of greenhouse gas accounting, a lot of the work on greenhouse gas accounting and decarbonization goals so far has all been non-financial based. So financial metrics where you're procuring something don't count towards your emissions reduction goals, except in the case of electricity, where there's been a lot of work to sort of disaggregate between RECs and power purchase agreements and the various mechanisms by which companies can procure energy, and when a procurement enables them to make claims versus when they have to actually sort of install the solar themselves or invest in it themselves. And I think a similar amount of rigor has to happen on the CDR space. To date, at least from CDP and science-based targets, offsets don't count because it's a financial mechanism. It's not a decarbonization within your own operations. And as we look to CDR, as Jeremy was mentioning, there's all sorts of ways that companies are putting their money into this. And some are in investment, some are in philanthropy, which we didn't even really talk about, and some are in sort of certificates or offsets or credits. And I think as we start to integrate the financial mechanisms and sort of define those out better and then start to integrate those into what counts towards corporate claims, that will start to clarify some of this. And until we have those disaggregated, I think we need to be really careful about mixing greenhouse gases and dollars. We can then get into the in-setting discussion where you're actually investing in carbon dioxide removal within your own greenhouse gas footprint, and that's a whole other discussion. That's webinar number 2.
Thanks, Betty. So making a slight shift in focus to offshoring emissions. So many of the emissions of consumers and companies in the north are actually located in the south. And how would localized emissions from biology through tech be taken into account for duties locally within the south or within the north?
I've been speaking. I can sort of try to answer quickly. So a lot of my work at CDP was around supply chain engagement and helping companies engage their suppliers on their own accounting and then their own target setting, and using procurement mechanisms to incentivize suppliers to take their own greenhouse gas accounting seriously. And a lot of that is now being replicated in the science-based targets and increasingly net zero space, where companies like Microsoft are asking their suppliers to account for their own emissions. And now they're increasingly assigning their carbon price to those suppliers and sort of taxing internally and asking those suppliers to set their own emissions reduction goals and incentivizing it through all sorts of procurement mechanisms. And in that way, we're able to get to incentivize a lot of action in companies who are emitting in other countries, but because of procurement somewhere else, or they're creating the supply because the demand is somewhere else. And so we're trying to use, at least from my perspective, scope 3 and greenhouse gas accounting to drive action on emissions, no matter where they are in the world, through the power of procurement, and ensuring that the financial incentives are aligned so that companies everywhere can find mechanisms to decarbonize. Then we get to all sorts of other issues about what their opportunities are and what's available to each company. But procurement is a really strong lever to get us pretty far along.
Thanks. And I think this is probably going to be our last question. So is it harmful to talk about offsetting when trying to keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius? Seems like the time for that is past. Is offsetting just allowing companies to greenwash? So, Jeremy, go for it.
Yeah, I definitely say it's harmful to do things that we think or we claim to be good that are not good. So just to be super clear, most things under the umbrella of offsets have had that problem. And I absolutely think it is harmful to, to sort of embrace the fiction that we can spend a small amount of money on stuff that's not real and actually have an impact on this huge, enormous, unbelievably daunting problem is a huge issue, and we absolutely have to stop doing that. I want to decouple that from the fact that I think the best science right now tells us that if we want to achieve the ambitious targets we've laid out, carbon removal specifically has to be part of the solution. It absolutely is not the only solution. And in fact, if we just do carbon removal, there's no chance that we're going to get anywhere close to the goals that we need to achieve. But even in sort of the best case scenarios in terms of mitigation, we also on top of that need to do carbon removal. So I'd say two things simultaneously. One, yes, offsets have not worked, and we got to stop doing stuff that's not working. We don't have time for it, and we need to immediately stop that fiction. We do need to do carbon removal, and we need to do a lot of it quickly, and it's going to be expensive, and it's going to be really large scale, and we need to figure out how to do that. So I think we need different mechanisms, and we've been talking a lot about how to make sure, from all angles, we're kind of investing and really making sure we're ramping up carbon removal efforts. We got to be doing it, and we got to be doing it fast.
Betty or Alex, any 2-second comments you want to make? Betty.
Sure, I would say from my perspective, I think we're leading now the Trillion Trees initiative. I think if we fixate on offsets, we're going to miss all the bigger impacts and all the bigger opportunities. So I think in addition to everything else we've discussed, investing in what we're calling nature-based solutions to climate and water and biodiversity and ecosystem services and human health and all the other impacts can only benefit all of us now into the future. I think we need to get all the accounting right and the claims right, but I think making investments into nature as part of this broader strategy has so many upsides. I can't think of too many downsides. I can't find anybody yet who hates trees.
Great. Well, we're at time. So thank you everyone for coming and attending and your great questions. And thank you to our fantastic panelists for a great discussion. We hope to all see you again at the next webinar in this series.
Here, everyone.
Thanks, Nicole. Thanks to the audience.
Nicole.
Cool.